The Galactic Council's grand chamber echoed with the murmur of alien voices, filling the domed hall with tension. Representatives from dozens of species occupied their respective seats, each one uniquely adapted to accommodate the physiology of their kind. Some floated in containment fields, others perched on crystalline platforms, while a few sat in ornate, gravity-bound thrones. At the center of it all was the circular podium, where the debate had raged for hours. The matter at hand was contentious: humanity's place in the interstellar political landscape. The Terran Confederacy had only joined the Galactic Council a few decades ago, a blink of an eye in the cosmic timeline. Yet, in that short span, humanity's actions had sent ripples through the galaxy's intricate web of alliances. They were a species unlike any other, empathetic, yet unpredictable, diplomatic, yet daring, and it was precisely these qualities that had unsettled the long-established powers of the Council. "These humans disrupt balance wherever they go," growled Councillor Yarrick of the Broxtar Dominion. His reptilian eyes narrowed, his voice slithering across the chamber. "Empathy. They wield it like a weapon, wrapping it around the minds of weaker factions until they bend to their will. Look at the rebellion in the Myrath system, sparked by human negotiators whispering promises of freedom." At the mention of Myrath, a low murmur spread through the chamber. The rebellion had shaken the Council's confidence, overturning centuries of oppressive rule by a coalition that had once been the Council's bedrock. The rebellion's success was largely credited to human diplomats, who had convinced the Myrath factions to set aside generations of distrust and unite. A delicate chime silenced the room as High Chancellor Zelvaris raised her hand. The Chancellor, a being composed of shimmering, translucent filaments, addressed the gathered representatives. "The question before us is not merely about human involvement in Myrath. It is about whether a species so young, with such unpredictable methods, should continue to have the influence it currently wields." Beside her, Councillor Garvek of the Ursoth Alliance leaned forward, his armored carapace gleaming under the chamber's light. "We welcome the Terrans because we believed their fresh perspective would enhance interspecies diplomacy, but we underestimated their ability to destabilize. They act on instinct and emotion. They inspire movements, stir revolutions, and they do so without regard for the consequences." At this, Councillor Tavar of the Lyrian Union raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "You speak as if instability is inherently harmful. The Myrath rebellion ended an unjust rule. The humans reminded them that peace without justice is no peace at all. Isn't that something we should value?" The debate raged on, factions forming and dissolving as representatives took turns defending or condemning humanity's growing influence. The Broxtars, Ursoth, and other dominant factions were united in their belief that humans posed a long-term threat to the delicate balance of the Council. Meanwhile, smaller factions like the Lyrian Union argued that the human gift for diplomacy and compassion brought much-needed change to stagnant power structures. The issue was clear: humans didn't play by the traditional rules. They treated every negotiation as personal, investing time and emotion into building genuine relationships across cultural divides. Their diplomats were known to broker truces with nothing but shared stories and acts of kindness, breaking down centuries of animosity between species. But this same empathy made them dangerous, too good at seeing past the politics and into the hearts of their counterparts. The Council had relied on stability for centuries. Change, especially when it came too fast, threatened the established order, and the humans, they embodied change. Chancellor Zelvaris finally raised her hand once more, and the room fell into a tense silence. "The matter is clear," she said. "We cannot deny that humanity's involvement has disrupted long-standing agreements and emboldened those who wish to challenge the old order. Therefore, I propose a resolution to limit human involvement in interspecies diplomacy to advisory roles only. Their diplomats may observe and advise, but they will no longer lead negotiations or shape policy directly." A wave of murmurs rippled through the chamber as the representatives processed the Chancellor's proposal. Limiting humanity's influence would mean sidelining one of the most effective diplomatic forces in the galaxy. Yet, many felt it was the only way to preserve the Council's authority. After a brief pause, Chancellor Zelvaris gestured toward the holographic voting interface. "We will now vote. The future of human diplomacy within the Council depends on your decision." One by one, the representatives cast their votes. The holographic tally hovered above the podium, displaying the results in real time. As the final vote was recorded, the outcome became clear. The resolution to limit human involvement had passed. The chamber was filled with a mixture of satisfaction, frustration, and unease. The dominant factions, those who had pushed hardest for the resolution, appeared pleased with the result. But among the smaller factions, there was a palpable sense of unease. They had relied on humanity's diplomacy to protect their interests, and now they faced the uncertain future alone. Across the chamber, Ambassador Elias Ford of the Terran Confederacy stood with a stoic expression, flanked by his team of diplomats. The humans had anticipated this outcome, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Ford knew that his people had become too influential, too fast. The Council had grown uncomfortable with a species that seemed to wield compassion as both a tool and a weapon. As the Council session adjourned, Ford turned to his team, his voice low. "Well, there it is. We've been benched." One of his junior diplomats, Sarah Lennox, frowned. "They're making a mistake. They think stability is the same as peace." Ford nodded grimly. "They always do, but now we'll have to watch them figure it out the hard way." Back on Earth and throughout human colonies, the news of the Council's decision was met with frustration. Many viewed it as an insult, a rejection of the very qualities that made humanity unique among the stars. For decades, humans had fought to earn their place at the table, only to be sidelined just as they were beginning to make a difference. Yet, despite the disappointment, there was a quiet understanding among the human diplomats. They knew that empathy was not a weakness, nor was unpredictability. It was their greatest strength, and it was something the Council could never truly control. Ford and his team left the Council chamber that day, knowing that the story was far from over. The galaxy was vast and complex, and crises had a way of finding even those who sought to avoid them. And when that happened, when the delicate balance the Council cherished so much began to falter, Ford knew that humanity would be ready. Because humans didn't just survive chaos, they thrived in it, and when the galaxy's carefully crafted order began to unravel, they would be there, waiting to bring it back together again. For now, they would watch from the sidelines, but not for long. The months that followed humanity's exclusion from interspecies diplomacy were marked by unease throughout the galaxy. Initially, the Galactic Council assured its member factions that the new restrictions would promote stability, returning diplomacy to the measured hands of more experienced species. But cracks began to show almost immediately. Agreements that once held firm under human mediation began to unravel, and alliances formed with the help of Terran negotiators started to wobble. At first, the changes were subtle, minor trade disputes between factions, usually resolved by human diplomats with a few well-timed compromises, escalated into full-blown economic blockades. Neighboring territories, once held together by the sheer goodwill of human intervention, began to reassert ancient grievances. Many species, accustomed to humanity's unexpected ability to broker peace through empathy and shared understanding, now struggled to communicate without them. In one of the outer sectors, a dispute erupted between the Thrix Consortium and the Drayan clans. The conflict started over mining rights on a shared asteroid belt, a relatively minor issue that should have been resolved quickly. But without a skilled mediator to soothe tempers and find common ground, both factions dug in their heels. Trade between their worlds halted, and their respective economies began to falter. The Council sent envoys from other species to intervene, but their efforts only made things worse. The humans would have solved this in days. A frustrated Drayan representative muttered during one of the Council meetings, his fur bristling in irritation. "They would have asked us why we mine at all and found a reason for us to share. Now look at us, on the brink of war over rocks." The Council could feel the growing tension, but many of its members refused to acknowledge the role humanity had played in keeping such conflicts at bay. "We do not need humans meddling in every dispute," argued Councillor Yarrick of the Broxtar Dominion during a heated session. "If these factions cannot resolve their own issues, then perhaps they deserve to collapse." But it wasn't just the Thrix and Drayan dispute. Across the galaxy, other cracks began to form. Trade routes between once cooperative factions became perilous, with accusations of piracy and sabotage becoming more frequent. Long-standing agreements between species, agreements nurtured by human diplomats, crumbled under the weight of distrust and miscommunication. One of the most alarming signs of instability came from the Myrath system. The rebellion that human negotiators had helped organize had initially led to a fragile peace. For the first time in centuries, the various Myrath factions had begun to work together to build a better future. But now, without human mediators to guide them, the old rivalries began to resurface. Disagreements over governance sparked bitter debates, and factions that had once fought side by side threatened to tear the system apart again. Watching from the sidelines, human diplomats could only shake their heads. "It's like watching children fight over toys," Ambassador Elias Ford muttered during a briefing on the Myrath crisis. All they need is someone to remind them why they came together in the first place. But the Council's restrictions remained in place, and humanity's hands were tied. They were barred from leading any negotiations or taking decisive action. The frustration among Terran diplomats grew with each passing day, especially as they saw problems unfold that they knew how to fix, but were forbidden from touching. Some factions quietly reached out to their former human allies, asking for unofficial advice, but even this was risky. The Council had made it clear that any faction found conspiring with human diplomats outside of authorized channels would face severe sanctions. The message was clear. Humanity's influence was not welcome. The consequences of sidelining humanity soon became too big to ignore. In the Arath sector, a coalition of previously allied species dissolved over a dispute regarding military aid. Without human negotiators to smooth over the disagreements, the coalition's members reverted to suspicion and paranoia, each believing the others were plotting against them. The result was chaos. Skirmishes broke out along shared borders, and trade ceased entirely. It's like the glue holding everything together is gone, one alien trader remarked bitterly at a neutral spaceport. The humans were the ones who got us talking, trusting each other. Now, it's every faction for themselves. In the council chambers, frustration boiled over. Alien leaders found themselves bogged down by disputes that, in the past, would have been resolved in hours by human mediators. Councillor Garvek of the Ur-Soth Alliance, one of the strongest proponents of limiting humanity, found himself facing mounting pressure from his own people. "You said sidelining the humans would bring stability," a fellow Ur-Soth envoy snapped during a closed-door meeting. "Instead, we're watching everything fall apart." Councillor Tivar of the Lyrian Union, one of the few who had opposed the resolution against humanity, voiced what many were starting to think but were too proud to admit. "We underestimated what the humans brought to the table," she said. "It wasn't just their empathy or diplomacy, it was their ability to connect with others on a level we couldn't replicate. They made us believe in cooperation, even when logic told us not to." Despite these growing concerns, the dominant factions on the council refused to reconsider the resolution. To them, admitting they had made a mistake would undermine their authority. Instead, they doubled down, insisting that the galaxy needed to learn to function without human intervention. But the galaxy wasn't learning, it was falling apart. The breaking point came when the Vertal Republic, a highly militarized faction known for its rigid adherence to protocol, unexpectedly declared war on one of its closest allies, the Okar Federation. The reason? A minor misunderstanding about migration routes, something that human diplomats would have solved with a few conversations over shared meals. But without that human touch, the situation spiraled out of control. The Vertal struck first, and the Okar retaliated with devastating force. Within days, the conflict threatened to engulf neighboring systems. Panic spread through the council chambers. The war between the Vertal and Okar was exactly the kind of crisis the council was supposed to prevent. But without human diplomats to intervene, the council's envoys floundered, unable to de-escalate the situation. "We have to do something," Chancellor Zelvaris said during an emergency meeting. "We cannot allow the entire sector to descend into war." But what could they do? The council had tied its own hands by excluding the one species that excelled in bringing warring factions together. And now, the consequences of that decision were threatening to tear the galaxy apart. In a small room on a Terran space station, Ambassador Ford watched the chaos unfold from a holographic display, his expression grim. "They'll figure it out eventually," he said, though there was little satisfaction in his voice. "They always do." "Figure what out?" Sarah Lennox asked, her frustration evident. "That piece isn't about rules or treaties," Ford replied. "It's about understanding people, really understanding them, and that's what humans do best." The realization was spreading slowly, but inevitably. Without humanity, the galaxy was struggling to hold itself together. The Council's gamble had backfired, and now the question wasn't whether they could afford to keep humanity sidelined, it was whether they could afford to wait any longer to bring them back into the fold. Ford sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It won't be long now. They'll come knocking soon enough, and when they did, humanity would be ready." The galaxy spiraled toward chaos. Without humanity's guiding hand, instability festered in every corner. What began as isolated incidents of unrest grew into full-blown crises, threatening the fragile alliances that had once seemed unbreakable. And then the unthinkable happened. A rogue faction emerged from the shadows, taking advantage of the turmoil spreading across the galaxy. The Naskari Syndicate, a paramilitary group long believed to be fractured and scattered, launched a series of surprise attacks across neutral territories. Their targets included trade routes, diplomatic stations, and undefended colonies, territories caught off guard by the Council's recent distractions. The Naskari had sensed weakness and exploited it with precision. Chaos erupted across star systems as governments scrambled to respond. Trade lanes closed. Refugees fled conflict zones. Long-standing allies, now distrustful of one another without human mediation, hesitated to provide aid. The Council, overwhelmed by the rapid deterioration, struggled to form a coherent response. Inside the Council chambers, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Representatives from every faction argued over how to respond to the Naskari threat. The urgency of the situation exposed deep fault lines in the Council's leadership. Factions pointed fingers, shifting blame rather than finding solutions. Chancellor Zelvaris called for calm, her shimmering form flickering as she struggled to maintain authority over the discord. We cannot allow these rogue elements to tear our alliances apart. We must act swiftly and decisively. Councillor Yarrick of the Broxtar Dominion bared his fangs in frustration. Decisive action is what's needed, not more diplomacy. We must mobilize our fleets and crush the syndicate before it spreads further. But we cannot fight every battle alone, countered Councillor Tivar of the Lyrian Union, her gaze stern. Our strength has always been in unity, and that unity is failing. We cannot respond to this threat if we cannot even trust one another. The Council's indecision paralyzed it. The factions that relied heavily on trade were reluctant to divert military resources, fearing further economic collapse. Others demanded immediate intervention, but refused to coordinate their efforts. Meanwhile, the Naskari attacks intensified. Entire colonies were forced to evacuate, and diplomatic stations, once symbols of peace, were reduced to ruins. News of the devastation spread like wildfire across the galaxy, sowing fear and confusion. Ordinary citizens began to question the Council's ability to maintain order. As pressure mounted, some Council members began to regret their earlier decision to restrict human involvement in diplomacy. The very qualities that had made humans dangerous, empathy, unpredictability, and unconventional problem-solving, were now glaringly absent from the Council's deliberations. Councillor Garvek of the Ursoth Alliance, who had once championed the restrictions, now found himself reconsidering his stance. Perhaps we acted too hastily in sidelining the humans, he muttered during a private meeting. Their methods may be strange, but they were effective. Others, however, clung stubbornly to their pride. Bringing them back would undermine everything we've built, Yarrick snarled. It would show weakness. The Council's paralysis deepened. Meanwhile, on a small human colony located far from the central systems, Ambassador Elias Ford and his team monitored the crisis with growing concern. They had received scattered requests for unofficial advice from smaller factions desperate for guidance, yet the humans remained constrained by the Council's restrictions, unable to act officially. We're watching the galaxy fall apart in real time, Ford said, pacing the length of the room. They're running out of time, and they know it. Sarah Lennox, one of the junior diplomats on Ford's team, folded her arms, frustration evident on her face. How much longer do we sit here doing nothing? We could help. We know how to stop this. Ford stopped and looked at her. I know, but if we move too soon, we risk making things worse. They need to see it for themselves. The Council has to admit they need us, or nothing will change. But at what cost? Sarah asked quietly, her voice filled with frustration. How many lives will be lost before they swallow their pride? Ford had no answer. They both knew the truth. The Council would have to hit rock bottom before it reconsidered its stance on human involvement. Then, an unexpected message arrived. Encrypted and urgent. It was from an unlikely source, the Yalran Coalition, a small but influential faction that had grown increasingly alarmed by the Naskari threat. In the message, the Yalran requested an off-the-record meeting with human representatives. They believed only humanity could broker the cooperation needed to confront the rogue syndicate. Ford read the message twice, weighing the risks. If they intervened without Council approval, it could result in sanctions, or worse. But the alternative was letting the Naskari rampage unchecked, plunging the galaxy further into chaos. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, reading the message. We have to do it, she whispered. This might be the only chance we have to make a difference. Ford exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. The Council's pride had left the galaxy on the brink, and humanity had been forced to watch it happen from the sidelines. But now, finally, they had a way back in. It won't be official, Ford said, his tone resolute. No council orders, no authorization, just us doing what we do best. Sarah nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. We fix things, Ford smiled grimly. We fix things. Within hours, a small team of human diplomats and mediators quietly departed from the colony, bound for the Yalran-controlled sector. Their mission was clear: broker a coalition capable of confronting the Naskari threat and restore stability before the galaxy tore itself apart. Their absence would not go unnoticed, but for now they were out of the shadows, acting not as ambassadors of diplomacy, but as the agents of change the galaxy needed. Whether the Council was ready or not, they knew the risks. If they succeeded, they might earn back the trust the Council had taken from them. If they failed, they could be exiled from interspecies politics forever. But failure wasn't an option. The galaxy was unraveling, and only humanity knew how to bring order out of chaos. It was time to remind the Council of what they had so easily dismissed: that peace wasn't just about rules and treaties, it was about people, and no one understood people better than humans. As the human team's ship vanished into the stars, Ford leaned back in his seat, the weight of the mission heavy on his shoulders. "Hold on, Galaxy," he murmured to himself. "We're coming." And with that, humanity re-entered the game, not through official channels, but by doing what they did best: fixing the impossible, one crisis at a time. The human diplomatic team moved quietly, slipping through the galactic shadows with precision, honed from years of unconventional operations. Officially, they were acting without permission, but that didn't matter. The galaxy was on fire, and humanity had no intention of standing by while everything burned. Their first stop was the Yalran Coalition's territory, a critical hub, where they would attempt to stitch together a coalition capable of confronting the Naskari syndicate. Ambassador Elias Ford stood at the helm of the team's small, unmarked transport ship. Around him were the best human diplomats available: problem solvers, negotiators, and strategists. Sarah Lennox sat beside him, her fingers flying over the controls as they approached the rendezvous point. The Yalran Coalition had taken a gamble by reaching out to humanity, and now it was time to repay that trust. "This better work," Lennox muttered, glancing at the display showing their dwindling fuel reserves. "We've got one shot at convincing them." Ford gave a wry smile. "We only ever need one." They touched down at an isolated Yalran outpost. Neutral ground, away from prying eyes. Waiting for them was a group of nervous Yalran diplomats, their vibrant plumage ruffling with unease as the humans disembarked. A tall Yalran ambassador, Koresh, greeted them with a slight bow. "You came," Koresh said, his voice filled with relief. "We were beginning to think you would not." Ford shook the ambassador's hand. "We're here. Let's get to work." The first step was assembling a coalition of factions willing to confront the Naskari. It was no easy task. Trust between factions had deteriorated since humanity's exclusion from council politics, and many leaders were reluctant to work together. But Ford knew how to play to their strengths. He didn't approach them with grand speeches or political maneuvering. He approached them as people. "We don't need you to trust each other," Ford told the assembled factions during the first negotiation. "We just need you to trust us for now." It was a bold strategy, one only humans would dare to use. By offering themselves as the bridge between distrustful factions, the humans gave the coalition a reason to cooperate. Slowly but surely, alliances began to form. Old grievances were set aside, if only temporarily, as the factions realized that humanity's presence gave them the one thing they lacked: a chance at unity. But the Naskari syndicate wasn't idle. As the coalition took shape, Naskari operatives launched attacks designed to undermine their efforts. Sabotage missions disrupted communications, and assassination attempts targeted key leaders. The rogue faction knew the coalition was fragile and tried to shatter it before it could solidify. Ford and his team worked around the clock to hold everything together. They intercepted threats, smoothed over disputes, and kept the coalition focused on their shared goal. Every time a faction wavered, Ford reminded them of what was at stake. He didn't promise victory, only that, without unity, they would all fall. Sarah Lennox played a crucial role in keeping the coalition intact. Her natural empathy allowed her to read between the lines of alien cultures, identifying fears and desires that other diplomats missed. One evening, she pulled Ford aside after a particularly tense negotiation. "The Drayan faction is getting cold feet," she whispered. "They think the Yalran are setting them up to take the fall." Ford nodded thoughtfully. "What do you suggest?" "Get them talking about their families," Lennox replied with a knowing smile. "It's what they care about most, making sure their people survive. If we remind them they're not alone, they'll stay with us." The next morning, Ford led a private discussion between the Drayan and Yalran representatives. Instead of focusing on strategy, they talked about their homes, their loved ones, and the future they wanted to build. It was an unorthodox approach, but it worked. By the end of the conversation, the two factions weren't just allies, they were partners. As the coalition grew stronger, the Naskari Syndicate launched a desperate offensive. Fleet movements suggested they were preparing to strike at the heart of the coalition's operations. A decisive blow meant to scatter their forces before they could fully unite. Ford knew they had to act fast. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment," he told the coalition leaders during an emergency meeting. "If we don't move now, they'll break us." With limited resources and no guarantee of success, the coalition launched a preemptive strike. Human strategists coordinated the attack, employing unconventional tactics that confused and overwhelmed the Naskari fleet. It wasn't a traditional battle. It was a chaotic dance of misdirection, feints, and sudden strikes. The Naskari, accustomed to rigid strategies, couldn't keep up. Sarah Lennox led a team of diplomats on the front lines, negotiating ceasefires with smaller Naskari factions willing to defect. She met with former enemies face to face, offering them a choice: join the coalition and survive, or remain loyal to a sinking ship. "You don't have to fight us," she told one Naskari leader. "All we want is peace. Help us make it happen." Bit by bit, the Naskari's forces crumbled from within. Defections spread like wildfire, and the rogue faction's command structure collapsed under the pressure. The coalition's gamble had paid off. The Naskari were defeated, and order was restored. But the battle came at a cost. Lives were lost, and scars remained. The coalition had held together, but only just. As the dust settled, Ford knew their work wasn't finished. The real challenge lay ahead, convincing the Council that humanity's involvement had been necessary, not reckless. The coalition leaders, grateful for the humans' help, sent a joint message to the Council, demanding recognition for the role humanity had played in averting disaster. Without their guidance, the message read, we would not be standing here today. The Council convened an emergency session to address the situation. Anger simmered among some factions, particularly those who had resisted human involvement from the start. Councillor Yarrick of the Broxtar Dominion was livid. They defied our orders, Yarrick roared. This cannot go unpunished. But others, like Councillor Tivar of the Lyrian Union, saw things differently. They saved us, she said simply. We cannot afford to ignore that. The debate was fierce, but the truth was undeniable. Humanity had accomplished what the Council could not. They had brought order out of chaos. Punishing them would only deepen the fractures within the Council. Chancellor Zelvaris, her translucent form shimmering with exhaustion, addressed the assembly. We must decide not only what to do with the humans, she said, but what kind of council we wish to be, a council that clings to pride, or one that embraces unity. In the end, the council voted to reconsider humanity's role. It wasn't a complete reversal of the original resolution, but it was a start. Humans would be allowed to participate in diplomacy again, albeit with some oversight to prevent future disruptions. When Ford and his team received the news, they exchanged tired smiles. They hadn't sought recognition, but knowing they had made a difference was enough. Sarah Lennox raised an eyebrow. Think they'll trust us next time? Ford chuckled. They won't have a choice. As the coalition celebrated their victory, the humans quietly returned to their work. They knew that peace was never permanent, but they also knew that, as long as they were needed, they would be there to fix whatever came next. Because that's what humans did best. They thrived in chaos, and they built bridges where others saw only walls. The council chambers were silent as representatives gathered to vote on humanity's fate. The fallout from the Naskari crisis had forced even the staunchest opponents of human involvement to reconsider their stance. The coalition's victory over the rogue faction had been a sobering reminder that unity was not born from tradition. It was forged through understanding, empathy, and adaptability. Chancellor Zelvaris stood at the center of the Grand Chamber, her shimmering form flickering under the lights. We meet today not to discuss punishment, she began, her voice calm and deliberate, but to determine the role humanity will play in our shared future. Councillor Yarrick of the Broxtar Dominion scowled, his reptilian eyes narrowing. They acted without our authorization. They undermined this council. Tavar of the Lyrian Union leaned forward, her gaze steady. They saved us, Yarrick. Without them, the Naskari would have torn the galaxy apart. The chamber buzzed with murmurs. Factions that had previously aligned with the Broxtar were now divided, their trust shaken by the Council's earlier decisions. Some recognized that humanity's unorthodox methods were precisely what had kept the galaxy from plunging into full-scale war. Ford and his team stood on the side of the chamber, watching the debate unfold. They had been summoned to address the Council, a rare honor, given the circumstances. The invitation was both an opportunity and a challenge. Humanity's actions had forced the Council to confront uncomfortable truths, and now it was up to Ford to explain why they had acted as they did. When Chancellor Zelvaris gestured toward the podium, Ford stepped forward, his expression calm but determined. The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. "I won't waste your time defending what we did," Ford began, his voice steady. "The facts speak for themselves. We acted because you were paralyzed by fear and indecision. We acted because lives were on the line, and we acted because, when you needed us most, we refused to stand by and do nothing." Yarrick hissed, but Ford continued unfazed. "I understand why some of you fear us. We approach diplomacy differently. We rely on empathy, not tradition. We look for solutions where others see dead ends. And yes, that makes us unpredictable, but it also makes us effective." He scanned the faces of the gathered representatives, searching for signs of understanding. "The truth is, the galaxy is changing. The old ways aren't working anymore. You don't need us to lead you. You need us to help you adapt." There was a pause, the weight of Ford's words settling over the chamber like a heavy mist. Then, slowly, one of the Yalran representatives stood. "He's right," the ambassador said, her feathers shifting in agreement. "The coalition wouldn't have succeeded without the Terrans. They brought us together when we could not trust each other." Others began to murmur their agreement, and soon the tide of the debate shifted. Even factions that had been wary of humanity's influence began to recognize the value they brought to interspecies politics. "We must move forward," Tavar said, addressing the Council, "and we cannot do that by clinging to fear. Let us embrace the strength that humanity offers, not as a threat but as a partner." The Council deliberated for hours, weighing the arguments carefully. At last, Chancellor Zelvaris raised her hand, signaling the end of the debate. "We will vote," she announced. "The question is this: will humanity be reinstated as a full participant in our diplomatic affairs, with oversight to ensure accountability?" One by one, the representatives cast their votes. The holographic tally hovered in the air, each vote adding to the total. As the final vote was recorded, the result became clear. The resolution to reinstate humanity had passed. A ripple of emotion spread through the chamber. Relief for some, frustration for others, but the decision was final. Humanity was back in the game. Ford exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. They had done it. Against the odds, they had earned their place once more. Sarah Lennox leaned over, a grin on her face. "Told you they couldn't keep us out," Ford chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see how long it lasts." As the Council adjourned, the representatives began to disperse, returning to their respective factions with the news. The path ahead would not be easy. There would still be those who resisted humanity's influence, and challenges would arise as new crises emerged. But for now, humanity had proven that they belonged. Before leaving the chamber, Chancellor Zelvaris approached Ford and his team. "You did well," she said, her voice carrying an air of reluctant respect. "But know this: your methods will always be scrutinized. You walk a fine line, Ambassador Ford. Do not stray too far from it." Ford nodded, accepting the warning for what it was. "We're not here to cause chaos, Chancellor. We're here to prevent it." With that, the Chancellor gave a slight nod and drifted away, her shimmering form vanishing into the crowd. The human team returned to their transport, ready to resume their work. The galaxy was still fractured, but now, at least, they had the tools to begin mending it. Ford leaned back in his seat as the engines hummed to life, his thoughts already turning to the challenges ahead. "You think the Council's learned its lesson?" Lennox asked as the ship lifted off. Ford gave her a sideways glance. "Maybe, but even if they haven't, we'll be ready." As the transport soared into the stars, Ford allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. The road ahead would be difficult, but humanity thrived in difficult situations. They had shown the galaxy what they were capable of, not through force, but through understanding, and that was the real victory. The galaxy wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But with humanity back at the table, there was hope, a fragile but powerful force that could change everything. "Hold on, galaxy," Ford whispered, watching the stars blur into streaks of light. "We're just getting started." The transport vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind a galaxy forever altered by humanity's return, one where diplomacy, empathy, and resilience would be the tools that shaped the future. And for the first time in a long while, the future looked bright.